Longer term, it's about ISIL's vision, which includes, I actually call ISIL, here we go, right? ISIS, ISIS, because it's easier for me to remember that their long-term vision is the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham. And Al-Sham includes Lebanon, the current state of Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Kuwait. If they were to achieve that vision, it would fundamentally alter the face of the Middle East and create a security environment that would certainly threaten us in many ways.
يؤكد لنا
Syria is ready for cooperation and coordination at the regional and international level to fight terrorism and implement UN Security Council Resolution 2170. There would be no justification for strikes on Syrian territory except in coordination with us to fight terrorism. Anything else would be aggression.
وتدريب وتسليح وإيواء.
We asked our friends to arm our forces and send us weapons, and the Islamic Republic of Iran was the first country that provided us with the required weapons.
The Iraqi people require assistance, including defense assistance, but not soldiers, as they say, foots on the ground. We do not have any soldiers in Iraq. We don't intend to send soldiers to Iraq. We believe that the Peshmerga in Iraqi Kurdistan, as well as the Iraqi volunteers and regular army, are quite capable of defending their territory.
Well, the U.S. has been bombing so-called Islamic State militants in Iraq for weeks now, while Iran has been assisting Iraqi and Kurdish Peshmerga forces in their push to liberate territory recently lost to the militants. But now Washington is exploring targets to bomb in Syria. Earlier in the week, Syria's Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallim expressed his government's readiness to be part of an international coalition to confront the so-called IS. So lots to discuss there, and for that, let's bring in our guest for this evening. In the studio here, I'm joined by Dr. Eugene Dabous. He's a professor at the Notre Dame University in Beirut. From Tehran, we have Dr. Mohammad Marendi, professor at Tehran University, and Kenneth O'Keefe joins us from London. He's a political activist and a former U.S. Marine. Also in London, political analyst Mr. Jonathan Fryer. A warm welcome to all of you, gentlemen. Dr. Dabous, if I can begin with you here. Let's talk about those U.S. strikes, potential U.S. strikes into Syria against IS positions. Does that essentially put Washington, Damascus, and Tehran on the same side here?
Well, it does as far as their goals are concerned, but not with respect to their methods, because, of course, the U.S. is now threatened to hit IS targets without asking for Syrian government permission. And that, of course, is going against the position of the Syrian government. Okay,
we'll come back to that. Dr. Marendi, where does this leave U.S. efforts to overthrow the government in Damascus?
The belief here is that the Americans are stuck in a paradox. On the one hand, the Americans still continue to officially support the armed militants and extremists in Syria, but on the other hand, the United States wants to eliminate ISIL, and it is impossible for the Americans to continue with such a policy. So either the United States has to shift its policy towards Syria and somehow, in some way or form, recognize the Syrian government, or the problem will simply intensify. But of course, at the end of the day, even if the United States gets involved militarily, that is not the solution to the problem. In fact, that could actually make things worse. The problem really is the United States has a very, let's say, awful alliance with Saudi Arabia, which for decades has allowed for the rise of extremism and religious hatred. And the United States and its allies have closed their eyes to this reality until now it's become a global phenomenon, whether it's in Nigeria, in Boko Haram, or in Somalia, or Syria and Iraq.
Mr. Fryer in London, what are your thoughts on that? Can we seriously expect the Americans to be talking about confronting the threat posed by the IS when, as Dr. Marendi mentioned, it still has this unshakable alliance with the Saudis, which are in many respects accused of backing these groups?
Well, of course, the Saudi position itself is full of paradox, to use Dr. Merendi's term, because on the one hand, yes, they have certainly, either through government or more often through very rich individuals in Saudi Arabia, been backing various armed and militant groups. But on the other hand, they are now talking about standing up to the so-called Islamic State. So their position is very, very curious, to say the least. And I think one of the most interesting developments of the last few weeks has been because, of course, Iran and Saudi Arabia are now not just looking at across the Gulf with antagonism, as has so often been the case in the past, but realizing that actually in confronting the so-called Islamic State, they perhaps have a common cause. So it's not just the Americans who may be getting involved in this, but perhaps the Saudis as well.
Dr. Eugene, I see you're shaking your head there. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the Saudis have already reassessed their position. They've intensified their laws against their citizens funding terrorism in Syria and in Iraq and other regions. Pressures now on other countries like Qatar and Kuwait to follow suit, because if the funding would dry up, a significant step forward would be made. And I think here, again, the Iranians, the Americans, and the Saudis should be pulling in the same direction.
Ken, do you agree with that? Is this crisis a game changer for both foreign policy in the Western world as well as among those monarchies in the Persian Gulf?
Well, it most certainly is, but let's not forget the fact that actually what's happening in the Middle East is very much what was intended, and this policy of destabilizing, of fracturing all of the surrounding states to Israel, to sow the seeds of hatred and violence and sectarian divide. All of this is part of Oded Yanan's strategy for Israel in the 1980s. It fits very nicely into the Project for a New American Century's ideas of what to do in that region as well. And everything that we've seen over the last few years with regard to arming the offshoot of Al-Qaeda, which effectively it is Al-Qaeda, and let us not forget Al-Qaeda, of course, is a database, which is a database for the CIA, created very much by the CIA, with assets armed and funded by the CIA. So all of this is very much intentional. The real ultimate plan is going to happen as well. We're going to have some of these Western nationals who are traveling now to Syria and Iraq, have been for some time. Some of them will actually come back to the West, and some of them, I'm pretty convinced, will actually be legitimate organic terrorism in England or America. And of course, what will happen then? The governments will then scream, we must do something. The people will demand we must do something, and the concentration of power will become even tighter in the West unless we as people recognize this game, and I believe we do recognize this game by now. And we're not going to allow that to happen. But pretty much all of what's happening in the Middle East right now is by design, and policy papers from Israel and American dual national traders in the U.S. make clear that this was all part of the plan.
Mr. Fryer, do you recognize the game, to use Ken's terminology there? I mean, it's been pretty well documented that Western intelligence agencies, Persian Gulf states, have been supplying weapons and arming and supporting these militant groups. Why is the West now suddenly raising its hands in the air and screaming bloody murder?
Well, I think several of the governments, including, of course, the American administration, have realized that the genie is out of the bottle and, in a sense, has become a monster. Some of the groups that they were supporting before, particularly, obviously, in Syria, had what one might call much more moderate aims than the Islamic State. The Islamic State is something which is rather new, and I don't fully accept the argument that this is a creature or the creation of American or Israeli policy. I think, on the contrary, actually, the United States and, of course, Britain are deeply alarmed by what's happened with the Islamic State, and because of the fact, of course, that For example, in Britain's case, we know several hundred young British Muslims have been attracted by the ideology and the sort of adventure of war and gone out to Iraq and Syria, usually via Turkey as supposed tourists, and taken part in horrendous actions, including, of course, the disgusting murder of the journalist James Foley.
Dr. Morandi, your thoughts on some of that. Is this a genuine shift in Western foreign policy?
Well, that really remains to be seen. It's still quite early. Personally, I think this is a very complicated situation, and I think that the United States and its Western allies are complicit in the creation of ISIL in the sense that they did support the rise of extremism in Syria, and they coordinated Saudi and Qatari funding in order to bring down the Syrian government. After all, the former Syrian ambassador to Washington said that from the beginning we've always been supportive of the overthrow of the Syrian government because Iran's bad guys, as he called them, are worse than any other bad guy in this neighborhood. Something of that sort, he said. So the objective really was to punish Syria for its historic relationship with Iran and the resistance in Lebanon. But I think that it's whatever the involvement of the United States and complicity of the United States, Turkey, the Europeans, and the Saudis and Qataris in creating ISIL, I think they are sincerely fearful now. But I think it's not only stopping the funding that's going to ISIL or Jabhat al-Nusra or the Islamic Front that is important. It is something much more important that we must confront, and that is Saudi support for extremism in the ideological sense. The Saudis have been supporting the growth of Wahhabi ideology across the world, and that is one reason why we see similar trends of extremism in Nigeria and Somalia and Algeria and Libya and in Tunisia, as well as in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It's because the Saudi religious presence has been creating cultures of hatred across the board. And the international community, and especially the countries of the region, have to put pressure on the Saudi regime to stop this. And now I think the Saudis are themselves being threatened by the export of hatred that they've been doing over the past few decades. It's coming home to roost in a sense.
Yeah, and speaking of that extremism, Dr. Dabous, where does that Security Council Resolution 2170, which effectively calls on UN member states to suppress the flow of foreign fighters and financial support to terrorists in Iraq and Syria, leave groups like Jabhat al-Nusra? Let's not forget, of course, that we're all talking about these so-called Islamic State militants. There's a lot of other Al-Qaeda-linked groups that are operating in these countries. Where does that leave these groups and their regional backers?
Well, ironically, Al-Qaeda and Nusra, for example, are now looking relatively moderate in comparison. And Nusra, we shouldn't forget that Nusra does fight together with the Free Syrian Army, which is openly backed by the West.
So it's okay to leave them operate, that's what you're saying.
I think that they're going to have a hard time to separate them, because now what IS is doing is it's basically passing Al-Qaeda in a more radical sense, where Nusra was definitely seen as a terrorist organization by the United States, but its funding was not blocked. Nusra fights together with the Free Syrian Army, not only against the Syrian government, but also against the IS. So I think the US, I don't see this as a design that's finally working, if you will. I see this as a complete catastrophe for the United States. All of their plans are now in a pile of rubble, if you will, and they have to start from scratch. And I don't think that the US has a game plan at the moment.
Ken, what about this argument that weakening the Islamic State would essentially strengthen the government in Damascus? And that's certainly not something that, judging from the policies of Washington up to this point, that they would be very keen to do, is it?
there's no question whatsoever that Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian people have been facing a terrorist entity which has been a rebranded version of Al-Qaeda, and this incredible con of Al-Qaeda rejects ISIS. Come on. These people are CIA assets, and all of the top leaders of both of these groups are CIA assets, and it is silly to dispute that. So clearly it would be advantageous for the Syrian people first and foremost, and if you count Bashar al-Assad as a Syrian person, for him as well, if ISIS is, or IS, or whatever they call themselves tomorrow, is gone, because that is exactly what Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian people have been facing. And I think the soldiers and airmen of the United States military did a fantastic job last year after the false flag trying to lay the blame for a chemical attack on Bashar al-Assad last year in August. And I remember them putting up signs saying, "I will not fight for Al-Qaeda," quote, IS, in Syria. I will not, we were going to be an air force for them. I will agree with the last couple of speakers that this is a disaster for the United States, the empire. Clearly it is. Although all of this is very much part of the plan, we've reached a point now where the powers that be have lost all control, even though they have enormous resources. The media, governments, the military, the judicial systems, they're all pretty much lockstep in line with the policies that are handed down to the puppets in government. And they've been following the orders, and it looks to me that the orders effectively in this world are self-destruct orders. Basically, if you wanted to create a third world war, all of these puppets, whether they are prime ministers or presidents, are pretty much saying the types of things that you would want people to say if they wanted to have a third world war. When we look at Russia and we look at Iran, ironically, we find two sovereign states that have more maturity and discipline and intelligence within their governments, yet of course these are the two nations aside from Syria that we have been vilifying and trying to instigate conflict with. This is to me very obvious, and it would make sense that if we were looking at the policies of the people and the people that we're supposed to be entrusting as public servants, if you look at the way they're carrying out those policies, it would appear to me very obvious that it's a self-destruct policy. None of the policies in Syria, in Iraq, with Russia, anywhere make any sense unless you wanted to self-destruct.
Mr. Fryer, it does make sense to a lot of people, actually, this argument that these policies are intended to do little more than sow chaos across Syria and across Iraq and redraw the borders of the Middle East.
Well, I don't quite accept the argument that's just been put, I have to say. I think, for example, with Iraq, what's been very interesting is the emergence of Kurdistan very much now, I believe, on the road to independence. And of course, I think we have to take note of the fact one of the main reasons that the United States and Britain and others European countries have become much more hardline on IS is because, of course, the threat to Kurdistan that happened over the last couple of weeks or so. So I think we are seeing probably the unraveling of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that dreadful secret agreement which was made during the First World War by the British and the French, which essentially divided up the Middle Eastern parts of the old Ottoman Empire between them. And they were very artificial divisions, and they were inevitably going to come apart at some stage. But I don't accept your previous speaker's argument that this is all part of a great plan. I rather prefer the previous argument that it's all a bit of a disaster. It wasn't intended, and quite frankly, Washington has no real idea what to do.
Ken, your response to that, is that realistic, that Washington is making things up as it goes along, it's just responding to what comes up on the ground?
Well, I find it just absolutely remarkable that anybody believes that people like Barack Obama or George Bush or David Cameron or Tony Blair or any of these people make any policy decisions at all. I find it remarkable that anybody would even think that in analyzing the way this world functions. These people are puppets. They follow the orders and read the teleprompters. They don't have 1 ounce of independence within them. And if you ask me who's controlling them, who are the puppet masters, then you have to know who controls the financial system. Who are the private bankers who control the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank? There's the power right there. They have, with their money, been able to buy everything and anyone that can be bought, and all of the politicians, with the rarest of exceptions, are nothing more than puppets. And they, in my opinion, have been given self-destruct orders. Now, why would anybody want America and the West to self-destruct? Well, I guess if you see your system of power crumbling before you, and let me say, please, love and respect to the people of Palestine, you are well on your way to enjoying the sweet justice that is coming your way. And we have just witnessed in the last day Israel bow to the Palestinian people and Hamas and do something that must be the most painful thing ever for people the likes of Netanyahu and these rabid dog Jewish supremacist racists who have treated the Palestinians as subhumans for decades. The world is a-changing. This is obvious. And it seems to me that the powers that be believe that the only thing that can save their system of tyranny is an all-out third world war. And it seems to me also very consistent that the policies of the puppets that are being played out are also intended to self-destruct us into a third world war. I am confident, however, that they will fail in this, and I'm confident that we as people have recognized enough to not be able to play this game any longer.
Okay, Dr. Marandi, if I can bring you back into the discussion here, we went broaden the discussion. If we can come back to Syria for a moment and talk about some of the arguments that perhaps these U.S. airstrikes, which are allegedly aimed at targeting Islamic State militants, will be used as a pretext to launch the kind of operations that the Americans wanted to launch last year following that chemical weapons attack.
I find that highly unlikely. The United States really is no longer in the commanding position that it was, or at least it felt it was, in a decade ago. The Syrian government, if it falls, that would be a catastrophe for the whole region. And I'm pretty confident that even the Saudi regime right now would rather have
okay, Dr. Marandi, if I can stop you right there, because I want to get your thoughts. I want to get your thoughts then on some of what Ken was saying, that all of this is in fact intended to happen, that they are looking for this chaos, this, as he said, self-destruct mode that they're in.
Well, I personally think that U.S. policy is in chaos itself, and that the United States really doesn't have a policy, and neither does the EU. The United States, on the one hand, has been supporting extremism in Syria. I think that's well documented. Even initially, if you go back to the news reports, when Western nationals were going to Syria to fight, the reports were sympathetic back then. They were saying that these people are going to fight a despotic regime and to free their people. It wasn't the negative language that gradually began to emerge. So the whole narrative, if one goes back 2-3 years ago, has changed dramatically. In fact, the New York Times, I think just yesterday, had a headline saying that the Syrian government has to take the fight against ISIL more seriously, or make it a top priority, which is extraordinary, because the United States has never had fighting ISIL a priority. In fact, even when ISIL went into Iraq, the United States did not attack it. Only when it went towards Erbil did the United States respond militarily. And by the way, I'd like to add that the fact that Erbil was so easily beaten by ISIL and the Kurdish Peshmergas withdrew so dramatically, I think itself is a sign that the Kurdish area really doesn't have the power to stand on its own 2 feet, and its interests are really to stick with Iraq and for the Iraqi government to be both strong but also inclusive. They needed Iranian help desperately. Iranians helped the Kurdish Peshmergas with the consent of the Iraqi government. And so I think in a sense, this may actually strengthen the hand of the central government in Iraq. But there's no doubt that if the Iraqi government or the Syrian government fails, then that would be a catastrophe that is almost impossible to calculate.
What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Labous? How far are the Americans willing to go here? What are we talking about? Because essentially this video that was received, that gruesome video, we've all seen it, the murder of the U.S. journalist James Foley there when he was beheaded, seems to have given the Obama administration all the ammo it needs to rally U.S. public support and perhaps even get the approval from Congress to expand this military operation. Do you think that somewhere down the road we could be talking about boots on the ground in Iraq and maybe even Syria?
First of all, I'd like to disagree with the statements that have been repeated by some of the previous speakers that the U.S. does not have a foreign policy for the Middle East. It does have a foreign policy, as does the EU. Both of them have a foreign policy that's not working very well. The European Mediterranean Agreement is a codified part of European Union policy within the Mediterranean Arab states. There are policies gearing for the post-oil period in the Gulf states. And it's interesting that to have Iraq and Syria in shambles cannot be in the interests of the United States or the European Union, because these are the two countries that are the causeway, the link between the Gulf and Europe, which goes through Turkey.
Okay, so what's gone wrong then? How is it that they did end up in chaos?
They totally underestimated the staying power of the Syrian government. They totally overestimated the power of the Free Syrian Army, and they basically ignored the power of Al-Qaeda within that mix. And this has gone terribly wrong. But I think here they have the support of the Gulf states, because the Gulf states are investing billions of dollars in natural gas pipelines, which will go through Iraq and will go through Syria. They're investing billions of dollars in railroad links. They're looking at a 20, 30 years down the road when these countries will have to start living without oil. No one has an interest, except Al-Qaeda, in destroying the unity of Syria or Iraq. As far as boots on the ground is concerned, which is your original question, I doubt it. I sincerely doubt that either the European Union or the US will send in troops. What they are going to definitely do is to intensify the air war.
Mr. Fryer, what difference will that make, that air war? Let's say they do weaken the Islamic State position, the Islamic State militants on the ground. Is that change anything on the overall scale of things? Does that end the militancy, as Dr. Marandi mentioned there? The root of the problem is this militant ideology that's being exported from kingdoms like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others.
Yes, I think certainly if we see any sort of military victory in a sense from air attacks, at least halting IS advance, though it seems unlikely they'll be able to recapture some of the territory in Iraq currently held by IS, that isn't going to solve the problem at all. And I absolutely agree with something that was said earlier, that basically we have to address the ideology. Now, I'm rather reluctant to use that word, which is normally rather a good word, but the ideology of IS, in other words, this fanatical, intolerant, violent, appalling misinterpretation of Islam, which is doing huge damage to the reputation of the Muslim world and Muslims living in Western countries. And it really is essential that that root cause is tackled. And that does indeed, as one of the earlier speakers said, involve stopping the Saudis, convincing the Saudis that really this export of very narrow Wahhabism has been bad for large parts of the world and is completely inappropriate in the 21st century.
Yeah, but they're not willing to do that, are they? Ken, I tend to agree with you in many respects. I don't think any of this is an accident. Looking at it realistically now, is it possible that countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar are going to stop exporting this extremist ideology?
Well, Qatar
I have
has
no doubt of this, and the reason why is that the petrodollar system is living on borrowed time. Of course, the petrodollar system is what has provided the American people with a disproportionately very comfortable life. And this is really the big crime of the American people as far as I'm concerned, because we've sat by largely and pretended as if our nation wasn't committing horrendous crimes around the world. And this system is going to be no more. We see that the American system of dominance through the petrodollar is ending, and soon Saudi Arabia won't have a best friend backing them, and this nation is going to have hell to pay, that is for sure, because of the way it has carried itself. It has been in the business of terrorism. It has been the major sponsor of real terrorism, the most hideous and nasty form of terrorism you can imagine. And Saudi Arabia, it is known to have been sponsoring, funding, training, that sort of stuff for many, many years now. So this is not going to continue, just like Israel, with all of its power and all of its might, with its backing from the Security Council of the permanent members, America and Britain in particular. It is going to fall as well, because it has no choice in the matter once the people of the world have made their real humanity clear. And ultimately, this insane system of Saudis funding psychopaths to behead and run riot and bomb mosques, Qatar also doing their job in that regard, this insanity of America running roughshod over the world, being able to break every single law you can imagine to be able to kill en masse, simply label those it kills terrorists and get away with it. This insanity cannot continue, or we will, in fact, threaten a third world war and possible nuclear annihilation. We've actually lived with that possibility for many, many decades now, and I think, thankfully, many, many humans around the world, too many humans, have become aware of this insanity and are becoming engaged in understanding this insanity and have made it up in their minds that this insanity cannot continue. So Saudi Arabia's whole game will not continue much longer, neither will Israel's or America's, or this insanity of Western policy, sanctions against Russia. All of this madness is going to end either through a third world war or through a process of effecting genuine change and representation through our governments of the will of the people.
Dr. Labus, you look like you want to get a word in there.
Yeah, well, I definitely don't share this position. I think that we were looking at a catastrophe, but I wanted to pick up on another point, which is the intolerance and the Wahhabi Islam that's being spread by Saudi Arabia. That is a genuine problem. The problem is it is not outside of Islam. It is part of Islam. And it's a very radical and dangerous part, but it's still mainstream. And what you see in the West is an equivalent in the United States. And you see American Wahhabis, if you will, exporting their radical form of Christianity to Africa, to Latin America. The US cannot go up against Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia when they have their own American or Western Wahhabi Christians in the United States. And George W. Bush was a prime example of how that got to have a scene at the White House for a certain period of time. So I think what we're seeing with ISIS and Al-Qaeda is we're losing track of the strength of the real problem within Islam, which is Saudi Arabia's funding of intolerant Sunni Islam, which is mainstream but only part of the picture. What Muslims are facing around the world now is that their religion is being branded as radical, but we're losing sight of the Wahhabi threat, which is much larger.
Dr. Marandi, do you agree with that? This Wahhabi trend, this extremist trend, ideology, whatever you want to call it, is mainstream and therefore cannot be tackled so easily?
I think it would be best to say, at least in my opinion, that Wahhabi Islam was not mainstream at one point. It was a very obscure trend within the Islamic world that was limited to parts of what we now call Saudi Arabia. But unfortunately, due to the fact that the Saudi regime, which is allied to the Wahhabis, it has been for almost 3 centuries now, because of the oil wealth that it has access to, and also the access that other Arab despotic regimes as well, oil-rich despotic regimes, they too have, and they too are associated with Wahhabism. Because of that, they've been able to expand this school of thought dramatically across the globe. For example, in a country like Egypt, which has been historically extraordinarily important, and the Al-Azhar school is known throughout the world. Yet, because of the poverty, the relative poverty that we've seen in Egypt over the past few decades, especially with the increase in the price of oil, the Saudis have been able to make great and major inroads into the country. Saudi religious centers, Saudi mosques, Saudi imams, people going to Saudi Arabia to study Islam. or at least the Saudi version of Islam, and that has made it very difficult for mainstream or the old mainstream Islam in countries like Egypt, Pakistan, and elsewhere to compete, because the mosques, though traditional, though moderate, but conservative but moderate, they simply did not have the finances to compete. So Wahhabism, in a sense, has become mainstream in many ways, but it is still, I don't believe, a majority view in the Sunni world, and it wasn't mainstream. The reason why it has become mainstream is because of the sheer power that comes with Saudi wealth, and I think little else is involved.
Okay, Dr. Marandi, I want to stay with you for a moment because we're talking about the role of these different regional powers. Let's talk about Iran's role in all of this. On Tuesday, it was surprising to many when the Iraq's Kurdish leader Masoud Barzani thanked the Islamic Republic as being the first country to send assistance to the Peshmerga forces in their fight against the Islamic State. How do you think comments like that would go down in Washington?
That's hard to say. I'm sure that the Americans, on the one hand, again, this is sort of paradoxical. On the one hand, I'm sure the Americans would not like to see good relations between Iran and any other force in the region, whether a political organization or a country, good relations to develop. That's not what the United States wants. But on the other hand, really the only way to restore stability in this part of the world is for regional cooperation. It is important to note that, as I said earlier, Iraq's sovereignty for Iran is of utmost importance. And Iran's support for the Peshmergas in the Kurdish part of Iraq was with the consent of the Iraqi government, just as the Iranians also gave support to the central Iraqi government directly in defending the areas that were being attacked by ISIL. Iran's support for the Peshmergas were within that broader framework. And again, I think this is a very important point, although I haven't really heard it debated much in the West, but I have heard it here, and that is that the fact that the Kurdish Peshmergas were so surprisingly weak in the face of ISIL or Daesh is quite revealing, and it shows that at the end of the day, the Kurdish government in Erbil really needs regional allies to be able to stand on its own feet. And the best regional ally that they can have is the Iraqi central government. It would be a fundamental mistake to divide Iraq. It would not only strengthen regional divisions, but it would also create poverty in the long run and also mutual history among the Iraqi people. So from the Iranian perspective, the Erbil really has no option but to stay within the framework of the broader Iraqi government. That's the Turkish belief as well. That's the Iraqi government belief. And I think ISIL has also shown the fundamental weaknesses in the Erbil government. So the best way for overall security for the Iraqi people is for them to support one another.
Mr. Fryer, the Kurds, however, the KRG, they are getting support, it seems unlimited support now from all these different Western governments. Watching, footage over the last couple of weeks, you would think that the German officials, British officials, French officials are falling over each other to pledge their support to Erbil. Do you think that stuff like that is intended to encourage their Kurdish separatist aspirations?
Not necessarily to encourage separatism. No, I don't think that's the case. There is no particular desire on the part of any of the European countries, certainly, to promote the division of Iraq. Nonetheless, obviously, if the Kurds in Iraq decided that that was the best way forward for them on the principle of self-determination, then Europe would, accept what they decide. But to pick up the point about the alleged weakness of the Peshmerga. The problem was that they were very poorly armed because they had just not been expecting anything like this sort of assault, and the extraordinary rapidity with which IS moved and then took over Mosul and started to threaten Erbil itself. So basically the Peshmerga and the KRG government were saying, look, to the West, to European countries, we don't want troops, but please, we do need proper weapons because we have not got the military hardware to handle this matter. But we've certainly got the men to fight, indeed women to fight, because there are women Peshmerga as well who are prepared to stand up. So no, I don't think the West is trying to break up Iraq, but as I say, it would listen sympathetically if the Kurds decided that was what they wished to do on the road to self-determination.
Okay, Ken, I want to go back to you for the unconfirmed reports. Maybe the West doesn't want to break up Iraq, but there have been many suggestions that the Israelis are looking to set up shop in the Kurdish autonomous region of Iraq, and that they're essentially hoping that would materialize into a state down the road.
Well, you've led into exactly what I was going to point out, and it is an established fact that Israeli interests are all over the Kurdish region of Iraq. I would very much disagree with the last speaker about the West's intentions for Iraq. It has been laid out very, very clearly. Again, we go back to Oded Yanan's A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s and policy papers and many statements. Joseph Biden and others have made very clear as well that the intention really is to break up Iraq into three sectarian nations, basically Shia, Sunni, and the Kurdish region. The Israelis have been getting a foothold in the Kurdish region. I think that the movements of ISIS throughout Iraq that was affecting even Sunni and Shia areas was not problematic, but once they started getting into the Kurdish region, where I don't believe they had any approval whatsoever from their paymasters in Saudi and Qatar and ultimately the Americans, CIA, I don't think they had approval to go towards to Mosul and towards Kurdistan. I don't think they had approval to touch that area because Israel intends to access that oil and has been doing business along those lines for all of this period of destroying Iraq. So it is very much part of the plan to break up Iraq. I can't believe anybody would really dispute this. Certainly the policy has done a fantastic job of splitting that country up along sectarian sectarian lines. So I really don't know how people can ignore that.
Dr. Dabous, you look like you want to dispute this.
Yes, definitely. I think that the United States has a keen interest in maintaining the integrity of Iraq, as it ultimately does the integrity of Israel and of Syria. There is a game plan. Of course, Israel plays a role. These three countries down the road should become close allies of the United States and of each other. This is not working. Obviously, it's not working. But to say that the opposite is true, that the U.S. wants to destroy the unity and integrity of Iraq and Syria, is absurd because these two countries are much too important for the region and its future. And we can't look at the history and we can't look at the present of these regions without looking at the possibilities for the future. And if we're looking where the economies are going, they're going to a post-oil economy, a post-petroleum economy where future industries, not only transportation, which is really booming in the region, but also high-tech industries, natural gas, transportation. All of this is not going to work if these countries are broken up.
Dr. Marandi, there is another alliance that some regional experts have pointed to as being essential to beating the IS, and that is the alliance between Tehran and Washington. Speaking about the future, could we see a level of military cooperation, open military cooperation between those two in their fight against the Islamic State?
Well, first let me just respond to one point that was made earlier with regards to the Kurdish region of Erbil, and then I'll respond if that's okay. And that is that actually the Kurdish groups were very well armed. And they didn't even wait to fight ISIL. They quickly evacuated the territories that were occupied by ISIL. And that did show a very fundamental flaw in the defenses of the Kurdish territories. In fact, if you recall, when ISIL took the northern territories and didn't touch the Kurdish regions, the Kurdish Peshmergas were put on high alert, and they actually took new regions in Iraq without the consent of the Iraqi government. And in the Western media, there was a lot of talk about how well-trained the Peshmergas were. Another thing is, and this is again shows the paradox of American regional and European regional policy and why I believe it is in shambles, and that is that on the one hand, the United States and the Europeans speak about Iraqi sovereignty, but on the other hand, in effect, when they deal with Arabil without the consent of the Iraqi central government, and when they disregard the constitution of Iraq, that is basically weakening the Iraqi central authority. Now, whether you believe that the Americans want the unity of Iraq or not, the fact is that American actions have not been, or the European actions have not been in line with such a policy. With regards to Iran and the United States, no, I don't think there's any sign of not an alliance at all, but even rapprochement at this stage. The Iranians are still looking to see if the Americans are willing to change their attitude fundamentally towards Iran. And for the Iranians, the litmus test is the nuclear dossier. If the United States succumbs to some sort of agreement with Iran over the Iranian nuclear program and accepts Iran's sovereign rights to enrich uranium and to have a peaceful nuclear program, then from the Iranian perspective, Iranian-American cooperation in other fields could be discussed, seriously discussed perhaps in some cases. But even if we do reach that stage, and it's not at all clear if that's the case, Iranian mistrust towards the United States is very high. The Iranians don't trust the United States not only because of American policy towards Iran, but also because of American policy in Palestine and towards the Palestinian people, because of American policy in Syria. The Iranians believe that the Obama regime is soaked in blood because of the civil war that they were very much involved with. And the Americans are just as guilty as Saudi Arabia and others for the spread of extremism in this region and beyond. So there's a huge wall of mistrust that the Iranians look over towards the United States. And I think that those countries and some media outlets in Saudi Arabia and other countries have been making this argument, but it's not really something to be taken seriously.
Okay, on that note, I'm afraid we have run out of time. I want to thank all of my guests, of course, Dr. Eugene Dabous here in the studio, in Tehran, Dr. Mohammad Marandi, Kenneth O'Keefe in London, and also in London, Mr. Jonathan Fryer. And of course, thank you for watching. Don't forget that you can catch us again at the same time next week. Goodbye for now.
Longer term, it's about ISIL's vision, which includes, I actually call ISIL, here we go, right? ISIS, ISIS, because it's easier for me to remember that their long-term vision is the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham. And Al-Sham includes Lebanon, the current state of Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Kuwait. If they were to achieve that vision, it would fundamentally alter the face of the Middle East and create a security environment that would certainly threaten us in many ways.